Hi, I'm Jason Gorber for ThatShelf.com, and we're here to talk about Denis Villeneuve's Dune Part 2.
Big shelf.
So it seems like forever that we sort of experience Denis Villeneuve's Dune. It's one of the films that got caught up in the whole COVID theatrical debacle, and we're all sort of waiting for the big, grand films to make a big splashy appearance, and many of us were suffering for very justifiable lockdowns. It's funny to think of, it's just a few years ago, but it seems more distant than it is, rightly or wrongly. But what the first Dune gave us, I think, surprised a lot of people, for good, for bad. As I said when I did my first Dune review, I have no skin in this game at all. Unlike, let's say, even The Lord of the Rings or other things that I absolutely grew up obsessed over, Dune was never something really close and dear to my heart. I read the book once. I've told the story many times. I put the book down. I walked to my local Jumbo Video, picked up the David Lynch VHS, and watched it. That's the one and only time I've ever watched the Lynch film. I've actually been waiting to watch it until the culmination of Villeneuve's vision, as it were. And I sort of I knew these were grand narratives that sort of continued multi-books, and I certainly at the time when I read it, when I was a teenager, I didn't get any of the overt allusions to everything from Lawrence of Arabia to Jesus. The only thing that I knew about the Dune project, as I did for so much of the sci-fi there, as a child of the Star Wars generation, was this was the stuff that the Star Wars people really drew upon. And you can definitely see that in retrospect. There's a lot of sword play, there's a lot of Jedi mind trick like things. And it's funny because when you know the sort of cover version, sometimes you're a little less patient with the thing that was the original source. And one of the things that I think Villeneuve's done extraordinarily well is to craft this film recognizing that so many of the tropes that came out of these books got adopted by other sci-fi franchises, some of which we sort of may have come to before. In other words, we got the cover version before we got the original, and he sort of toys with expectations that way, and I think in a really rich and extraordinary way. He knows what he's doing in terms of the narrative of crafting something that's new, but certainly playing with given genre expectations in ways that are quite extraordinary. In a funny way, just as there in many ways wouldn't be a Star Wars Spice Mines and Kessel and all this stuff without so much of the influence on Dune, there would be no Dune movie without the incredible influence that continues to this day of the effects work, the groundbreaking space battles, the way that you deal with the slightly more metaphysical elements within the context of something that frankly plays like a space opera. And I think that this is key. By the time you get to Dune Part 2, the operatic elements are fully enmeshed with the sort of more what we've come to expect from these kind of films, which are the grand battles, the strategizing, the conniving, the one-on-one battles with a number of people, the introduction of even badder baddies. You thought this was the bad guy, but really this is the bad guy. Heck, you got an emperor. You got all of that stuff at play here. And it brings the narrative forward. If the first film didn't have crazy much in terms of narrative in a good way, because it settled very much in terms of characters, that's set up entirely you caring about what's actually taking place in part two. The film starts seconds after the first film. They're carrying the body of the person who Paul has just bested in combat, and they're dealing with the ramifications of the House of Atreides being completely collapsed by the House of Harkonnen. There's a couple grand revelations we get along the way. We dive deeper into the things that we know in terms of his mother and their control of being able to sort of gestate the gender of the child within her that she wishes, a conversation that she has explicitly with her unborn child, which is a little, fascinating in a grand narrative scale. But as it plays out, it's sort of checking off the boxes that we've come to expect about. If I would have told you there's a story of a guy who goes to a desert planet and has to help those that are native to the planet overcome a bunch of people, you can see where this sort of narrative lines are coming. This is straight from the book, let's be clear. And because of that, it's going to be more simplistic, more obvious that people will simply chastise it for being merely Orientalism, white savior, whatever it's going to be. This is very much sort of headed down that road. But what's interesting, and again, it was in the book to a certain extent, but made overt now, given today's political climate or social climate, you have the Zendaya character who's questioning all of this. You have particular people making explicit that some of these messianic messages may be adopted by certain people because of their fundamentalist tracks, but that they are those that are actually at the center of the narrative are even questioning whether or not this is simply propagandistic, and that they're actually using the mechanisms of storytelling to convince people of particular truths, whether or not those truths are factual or not, undercut, of course, by so many of the so-called prophecies coming true. Now, to the point of prophecy, I stated that when part one happened, and you have Paul with his dream sequences, that it was going to be very interesting how those played out directly in conversation with part two. Whether these were just overt scenes that had been shot for part two and cut in, and it's really interesting. It's a real fundamental thing, and which is why I strongly encourage you to watch part one, definitely within proximity of part two, because so many of those so-called visions of the future are themselves reshaped, are sideways, are askew. Some of them are direct scene for scene, but some, the character that you see sort of play out is actually showcase a different character, someone else in the lead. So it shows when we talk about sometimes that we have it's made explicit within the film that not every vision that he has of what's to take place is what is actually going to take place. That, that ye old thing that we've gotten used to in Marvel movies, that there's a gazillion different ways that the future can play out. It's a matter of finding that path forward. Some of those paths forward he's seeing before he can actually control this sort of visionary being a seer, aren't the ones that actually play out. And it's very fascinating to see how that actually sort of echoes. I think that is one of the richer, more subtle things that people are looking at as just a grand escape might miss, especially if they have sort of fuzzy memories a little bit about what took place in part one. The visuals are stunning as always. The ship design, there's this chrome ship with these reflective materials, which is so beautiful. Again, echoing something they tried to do in the Star Wars films with some of the Naboo vehicles, the sort of Art Deco thing, and it looked Wild Against Desert, but the way that it's plated, there's just something incredible about some of the ship design. I just love the sort of feeling, the universe ethos that obviously Lucas helped pioneer, that Villeneuve's absolutely diving into. There's so much here to actually respond to on a visual sense. Equally, the action, by being ramped up, has some incredible fight sequences. It's beautiful choreography. It absolutely feels, thrilling, but it feels violent, and it feels that the sort of personal one-on-one battles are themselves flurries of action. This isn't, you don't feel a sense of like comic book posing. You just feel the sort of the collision of these close combat situations. Really, really fascinating. There are moments where you see sort of, again, the Lawrence of Arabia guerrilla fighting notions with RPGs and stuff like that. Again, all of this plays and has sometimes dark and sometimes fascinating echoes with actual combat taking place at this very day around the world in desert locations. But the fact of the matter is that these stories, by their very nature, are relatively universal. That you have different imperial powers, you have different people taking advantage of this, you have different, essentially, Games of Thrones, whereby different people are taking on different iterations. The bloodlines matter a lot, but also allegiances. You have certain people being disappointed about when things do not go their way. There's not a ton in the way of like overt communication, but you see some real clear things play out. Now, the scope of it, it's almost 3 hours, it's 2:45 or something like that. The scope of it will be off-putting for some people who feel like they've gotten sort of a taste of what it was in part one, but by being sort of allowing us to sort of go on this longer voyage, the textures, you can feel the sand, you can not simply go from one set piece or one action piece to the next, to the next, to the next. There are moments to breathe, just like the sort of plates as they lift up on the sandworm and things exhale. The sound on this film is unbelievable. I had a chance to see it in IMAX. They actually mandated in some ways that reviews actually took place in IMAX. The fact of the matter is that this is an audio triumph. Between Zimmer's music with his incredible cacophony of drums, that sort of wild rhythmic drum element, the choral pieces, which definitely have a North African, Middle Eastern vibe, just as he had brought in a Celtic vibe for the House Atreides, all playing out, but the sound effects, the sound of these diggers, the massive sandcrawler-like tread vehicles, again, more Star Wars echoes, all at play here. And it is just, and sometimes, anytime it's assaultive, it feels orchestrated, if that makes any sense. Anytime that it feels completely like it should be just a cacophony, everything is still coherent. And I think that speaks to the film as a whole. That it's throwing a bunch of stuff at you, but you still feel that you're very much part of this journey. Now, this is one but more step on the journey. Easily there could be a part 3. This obviously has, like the first one, if the first one only existed as the first one and all it was a character base, we would be fine. Dianu, this would be enough. If this is all we're going to get out of this incredible production team, so be it. It doesn't have to be a threequel, a trilogy. It doesn't have to be any of that stuff. We have a certain sense of where things are going, but it by no means wrapped up. There's no sort of grand triumph at the end. Again, unlike the Star Wars film, where we absolutely watch the first one, there's a big parade, like, a Riefenstahlian parade at the end, and then we were granted this sort of episodic continuation. I bring this up because Christopher Nolan has been talking about this film as being the Empire Strikes Back of the series, and I don't think that, I think that's both simplistic and inaccurate with respect to Nolan. I think that this film, in the Empire Strikes Back, in the absolute sense that it only truly derives its energy from you having the previous film to grow to care about the characters. And that was what I found really remarkable about the first Dune film, is that it was a character piece. I talked to so many people that saw it, and I think that you get in that sense where you're waiting for the narrative to move forward, that you're constantly sort of being undercut about your expectations. You're not paying attention to what the film's, I think, at its core, which is this relationship between this kid and the people that he fights with, his mom, his dad, their connections, and all of this stuff. A true character piece. The first chapter. Not an origin story in the broadest sense, but certainly getting the pieces together in order for you to sort of have them play out in grand sort of scheme in part 2. And at the end of part 2, we've already achieved a whole nother level of complication, a whole nother level where we're expanding from this more narrow conflict to a much, much broader and richer conflict. Now, there's all kinds of stuff, again, that I point to the narrative. The question is, like, why doesn't Superman just kill everybody? Why are they using swords when there are guns? Like, all these kind of questions that it's not a matter of suspension of disbelief. It's just a matter of letting the story sort of play out using its own rules and its own logic. And in some ways, you simply accept it. Why don't they have their shields on all the time? That sort of thing. These minor questions that if you really want to step back and start a nitpick, you can absolutely do that. That being said, if that's what you're focusing on, you're missing the grandeur of the whole. You're missing the way that it takes these myth-making stories and both does them in incredible, specific, and personalized versions, and you can see how grander myths will come out of the elements that actually take place during these events. You can see how hundreds of years after the events that we see unfold here, these stories will become grander, these stories will become biblical in scope, frankly. And that is very, very fascinating to see play out. How the film itself is interrogating its own storytelling within its own story. It is a pretty fascinating way of working. I have zero idea how this film will work for a general audience. I think that, and for some people, it will simply be overwhelming. I think some people will appreciate the spectacle and not necessarily get some of what I think are the richer and deeper elements that are contained within. so be it. I have no idea if financially it's going to sort of live up to hopeful expectations, which will sort of drive whether or not the studios will allow there to be a part three. I can't speak to any of that. I can only speak to this. I am so forever grateful that director of the capability, writer-director of the capability of Denis Villeneuve has assembled such an astonishing cast and crew to tell these stories in this way, and clearly the way that he wanted to tell them. There's so much love in what is being told here. There's so much affection for the source material, but being unafraid to step back and actually make it his own. And to, again, to question, to interrogate, to pick at the seams and still find ways of staying true to what came before. And I think that this not only will find a contemporary audience, but I believe that just like with any of these stories, this film will grow with age. I think that when you actually have time to reflect upon it, as you grow, as you watch the film again, and you see the new textures, and you see the new elements, and you appreciate the sacrifices, and the dynamics, and the metaphysical politics, the broadly religious politics, the gender politics, who is dealing with whom, who's coming into power, how power corrupts, how fear plays out, all these grand, myth-making tropes all coming together within something that is so sumptuously made and so beautiful. The desert landscape looks stunning. And again, a film that has moments of great, great loudness and cacophony and moments of just beautiful, immaculate quiet. It is extraordinary. And I truly recommend that you give it a shot on the biggest canvas you can. Definitely see it in IMAX. If there's one anywhere near you, ideally see it in proper 143 IMAX. I know that's a big chore for many people because there aren't that many that will absolutely be showcasing it. But the way that it works is it actually opens up specific sequences to the full IMAX aspect. It was easier sort of to determine the logic of it in the first one, where it was primarily many of the dream sequences. But here, you get a sense of scope of the verticality of everything, especially when you're in the caves or in the desert. It is pretty astonishing. That's our look at Dune Parts 2. May there be, if the sands allow it, if the spice allows it, let there be a Part 3 if it's something that Villeneuve wishes to conquer. I believe that you're going to get a little bit into the sort of next book that sort of creates a more obvious place, another landing spot that I think will actually make sense for a third film to accomplish without it being redundant, with it continuing to be a continuation of the narrative. I look forward to that potentially. But if this is all we have, then we can be here and celebrating what we have right now, which is an extraordinary, extraordinary film in Dune Part 2 by Denis Villeneuve and an incredible cast that he has assembled, some newcomers and some of the standard players that have come together to tell this tale on the grandest and most eloquent of scopes, as it were. For thatshelf.com, I'm Jason Gorber. Thank you so much for watching. Please enjoy the film. Let me know in the comments what you think about it when you finally get to see it, or sort of any fears or expectations that you have if you truly are a fan, or even if you're not a fan. I'd be interested to hear from you, of course. If you're not a fan of me, I'd be interested to hear from you as well. Please follow us on social media, subscribe, like, all of that stuff, and we will see you next video. All the best. Take care.